Welcome to the Develop Yourself podcast, where we teach you everything you need to land your first job as a software developer by learning to develop yourself, your skills, your network, and more. I'm Brian, your host. When you're starting to learn JavaScript, it can feel really overwhelming. Like, it can feel like you're in an ocean that's as wide as it is deep. And how much JavaScript do you really need to learn? Like, do you need to learn all of it? Can you learn all of it? Is that even possible? And because you're wondering, how do I get to the next stage? Because to learn React or Next.js or the next thing that's in your, roadmap, you're going to have to get a solid foundation in JavaScript. But what does that even mean? What does a solid foundation in JavaScript mean? I see a lot of people getting really stuck with trying to fit in and cram as much JavaScript as humanly possible into their brain, and they're afraid to move on because they feel like they still don't know JavaScript. So I've been learning JavaScript for about 10 years now, and I think I'll continue learning it to the day I either stop coding or die. Not to be overly morbid or anything like that, but yeah, JavaScript is really a lot to know. I mean, there's tons of books on it. Famously, there's 2 books on it that are really, really popular. JavaScript, The Good Parts, which is a really thin book, and then JavaScript, The Bad Parts, which is like a really, really big book, right? Ha ha ha, joke, 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 meme. Anyway, yeah, it's difficult to learn. There's full series on it. Kyle Simpson, JavaScript guru, wrote an entire series about you don't know JavaScript. Funny, he titled it "You Don't Know JavaScript" because that's the thing we all feel, right? No matter at what stage in our career, but especially at the beginning, you don't even know what you don't know yet. So I'm going to try to break it down for you and explain to you what I think you should know in order to move on to the next step so you learn enough. And you can always go back, fill in the holes, and you will be continuing to fill in these holes, learn new things throughout your entire career. Why is that? A little bit of background about why JavaScript is a slippery eel to try to mangle or wrangle, whatever analogy I was going there for. The reason why JavaScript is difficult to learn is because it's ever evolving. The JavaScript we learned 5 years ago is different from the JavaScript now. The introduction of things like TypeScript has also introduced more changes and flavors of JavaScript. Not to mention, there's a committee, a secret or not so secret committee called the TC39 committee, made up of a bunch of people, a bunch of developers that will look at proposals for new JavaScript features and say, yeah, that sounds like a good feature, let's add that in. Or, nah, that's not a good feature, let's not add that in. And they'll have different stages of this proposal where they will then finally introduce it so that everybody gets the benefit of using these cool things. Recently, I believe arrays got .at, there's .with on arrays now. You can go to MDN Web Developer Docs and generally look around the internet for the cool new stuff that's in JavaScript and was introduced in different versions that have come out. One of the major version that came out a long time ago, which you're probably familiar with if you've learned any JavaScript lately, is ES6, when we introduce things like let, const, classes, template, literals. Massive change, filter, reduce, map, for each. All these really now standard things that weren't standard for a while in JavaScript that really elevated the language a lot. Anyway, what we're going to go over is a list, a non-exhaustive list of what you need to know before you can move on to a framework like Next.js or learning React or whatever it is that's on your roadmap after JavaScript. And, after JavaScript in quotes, because you're never really done with JavaScript ever. You're always going to be learning it. But anyway, without further ado, here's what I think you should be learning. So fundamentals, of course. You need to know variables, data types, operators, control statements like if, else, and loops, functions, and the concept of how to return stuff from a function, what do functions do in general, how do you invoke them. And you'd be shocked about if, else, and learning loops. People that have studied JavaScript or claim they have or graduated from a program, went to a college, went to a boot camp, I am mind blown that some of them cannot write a simple if-else statement or a for loop, which to me is concerning, but also hopefully gives you some confidence if you're out there applying for jobs, because there's a lot of people that can't even write a for loop without looking it up. And I'm sorry to say, that to me is a big deal breaker. And I know people are going to say, well, you could just look that up. Yeah, you could look that up. But if you don't know these basic things, these are the foundational building blocks of JavaScript. If you can't be bothered to memorize a couple of these things, then maybe you don't really need or want to be a developer. Because I'm sorry, if you're working with your coworkers and you have to say, I forget how to write a for loop, I just don't see that going over well for you. And also, it's probably an indication that how are you doing anything then? How are you literally doing anything if you don't even know how to write an if-else statement? Anyway, learn that stuff. That is basic 101 JavaScript stuff. Next, DOM manipulation. Now you have the basics down. You need to be able to manipulate stuff on the screen. You need to be able to support events. So person clicks on something on the screen, something happens. You have click events. You can do hover events. Maybe somebody submits a form. You need to understand the basics of how to make stuff happen on the screen. Manipulate the DOM, the document object model. Basically, again, make stuff happen on the screen, right? Next, let's get into the interesting / harder stuff. Asynchronous programming. Handling asynchronous requests using callbacks, promises, and async await. This is really important to know because a lot of what we do in software engineering and with JavaScript or any other language or even with network requests or backend stuff is learning how to leverage asynchronous or multi-threads, or basically how do we not block other stuff from running when we want something else to happen. For example, let's use like a human analogy. Let's say you have some laundry to do and your kid wants to eat pizza. And your laundry is going to take 45 minutes, right? You're going to put it in the washer, it takes 45 minutes, and the pizza shop's down the street. If we were doing this in a non-asynchronous way, in a synchronous way, it means that we would put our clothes in the laundry, we'd wash it, we'd wait that whole 45 minutes before we go get pizza. It makes zero sense. Why wouldn't we go get the pizza while the laundry is in the washer doing its thing, right? That is asynchronous programming in a human terms, right? So asynchronous programming using promises, callbacks, all this other stuff, it's like, why do you care? Is it just some weird conceptual thing? No, it's a really important tool and concept that we leverage all the time on websites every single time you use them. Imagine you go to a website, you're doing some sort of task that takes a while, like fetching some data from an API. You have no clue how long that transaction will take. So you have two options. You can either, one, wait for that whole transaction to take place before you load the page, which would be a bad move, right? Because people don't expect to see a non-responsive page. Or you can do it asynchronously where you're fetching that data, but you're not blocking other stuff from happening. So you're maybe showing a loading state. Maybe you're showing other things that are happening on the screen. Maybe you're having multiple asynchronous requests happen and they're not blocking each other. And this way you can have a user experience that is not terrible, right? These things aren't just like super conceptual or for, academics or anything. These are things you should just get a slight grip on. So being able to leverage asynchronous tasks with callbacks, promises, and finally async await is really good. Understanding the event loop would be a nice to have. I'd say that'd be a more conceptual thing that could be cool to learn, but I don't think that's actually necessary. Now, for your interview, that question may come up, and I think you should have a one-sentence answer about what the event loop is and non-blocking code as a hint. ES6 features. So this is modern JavaScript. It is a little bit weird when I see people still writing var. There's nothing wrong with it. I know Kyle Simpson would probably hit me with a ruler if he heard me telling you not to use var, because there's nothing inherently wrong with using the var keyword. It's just that nobody really uses it anymore. Everybody uses const and let, for better or for worse. There are differences between these, and you should know them at a very basic level. Say, what's the difference between const and let? Super common interview question. I've been asked it a million times. I've asked that question a million times as an engineering manager. You should understand template literals, arrow functions, destructuring, const, let, all the cool array iteration features like map, filter, reduce, for each. These are just kind of standard things that you need to know nowadays, right? And when I say know them, I don't mean like explain exactly how they work under the hood. I mean how to leverage them, how to practically use them, and also understanding the difference between something like when do you use map versus when do you use for each? When do you use filter versus when do you use reduce? I'd say reduce is one of the more complicated ones that I see a lot of developers struggle with. Even junior developers that are hired on the job and maybe have a year or two of experience seem to have trouble with reduce, and I did as well. So I would say, with that in mind, make sure that you understand all the ones, maybe but reduce, but understand it enough to know how to use it. Next, closure. This is a tough one. I would say closure is the $10,000 concept. If somebody says, what is closure? That's like the $10,000 question. It's often the difference between junior, mid, senior, and the expectation at those different levels with how well you understand closure. Do you need to understand it to actually use JavaScript well? Some people might argue, yeah, you do. I would say that you may be using Clojure without even knowing it. And it is difficult to explain Clojure without having something to look at. And in this case, I say look it up, understand how to use it to privatize variables, how to encapsulate data, and how to leverage it for patterns like the factory pattern. Those are some practical ways you can use Clojure. And I don't think you need to have like a super academic answer. I think you could do like a one-word sentence, but have an answer for it for your interviews, if nothing else. And knowing how to leverage it, I'd say is a nice to have, not a must have. Let's go to some more practical things you should know with JavaScript before you move on. Absolutely, you need to understand using the fetch API. Without APIs, your JavaScript code is kind of worthless. Think about what we do on the internet all day. You go on Instagram or whatever social media platform you do, and this typically happens. You log in, and then you see a bunch of posts and comments under these posts, right? The way that gets there is generally through HTTP requests, fetch API. There's some sort of network request that happens where we go out, or the app goes out, fetches some data from that database or server somewhere out there in the cloud, some server farm in Ohio or wherever that's listening for your requests, and now it returns that data in the form of JSON, JavaScript object notation, big arrays of objects for all intents and purposes. Now you need to iterate over that data and then display it on the screen. That is generally how the web works in almost every single case. You go to Airbnb or you go to Instagram, they're doing the same thing. Open up the network tab, see what's coming back. It's a bunch of data that you're gonna display on the screen. And then we just basically are JSON handlers. I mean, maybe that's a cool word for front-end developers, actually. Maybe we should change front-end developers to JSON handlers. That's actually a probably more accurate description of what we do. We get data in JSON format, and then we display it in a nice, pretty way. We get a designer to tell us how to display it, and we do all the data munging to make sure it looks right, and we get the correct data, and we match it and do all sorts of cool stuff with it on the front end. Anyway, knowing how to leverage that is super important. Knowing how to make HTTP requests and responses, knowing how to debug them, especially, which lead me to debugging skills. You need to know how to debug your buggy ass code, because if you're a new JavaScript developer or a really seasoned one, you're going to be creating lots of bugs. And the more seasoned you get, you'll be investigating bugs that you didn't even make. You'll be investigating bugs that your younger teammates made, the newer ones made. They don't always have to be younger. Of course, they can be older and also be much more junior, and you could be investigating their stuff. So you need to understand how to leverage the browser tools like the dev console, using the debugger keyword, using console logs, using some combination of these things to understand how do you check that your JavaScript code is working or not working in the way you expect. Finally, basic tooling. This one is a big one. This doesn't quite fit into JavaScript land, but it does fit into software developer basics and 101 type stuff. You need to be familiar with your code editor. With Visual Studio Code, you need to probably understand a little bit about NPM, Node Package Manager. Understand that there's a ecosphere, a whole world of libraries sitting out there that you can easily grab using Node Package Manager, NPM. There's other managers out there now like Yarn or what's it called? PNPM. Anyway, you should understand that there's a ton of packages out there. Understand a bit about how the versioning works with these packages so that you're not getting the wrong version of one. I'd say that this could be also added on to your React or framework learning path as well. I don't think you have to learn that in order to go to the next stage. So now that you know these things, how do you prove that you know this stuff? How do you prove that you know all these general things like basic styling, DOM manipulation, event handling, asynchronous stuff, data manipulation, making a decent UI, all this kind of stuff? I would say you can build a pretty simple app. I don't think there's anything wrong with building a simple to-do list app in vanilla JavaScript, right? So this to-do list app may take the form of this, right? You could have a form. The form could have a input and a checkbox for whether that to-do list item has been done or not. Or in fact, it could just be that you add it to the screen and it's not done by default, right? Have an input, you click add, and then it's boom, added to the screen. How does that work? How does that work that when you click add, that it is now added to the screen and it goes in order or something like that, has a checkbox next to it. You click the checkbox and maybe 5 seconds go by, or maybe, no, I'm sorry. How about a second and a half goes by and then it's removed from the screen, right? What about this? What if the user refreshed the page? What happens then? Does everything just blow away, or does it get stored, maybe in local storage? That would be a great addition to this project too. Maybe if you want to add an API, you could use an API out there. There's a few out there that are kind of like placeholder APIs that you can use that are they're kind of like fake APIs in quotes. I mean, they're real APIs because you are calling them and using the window.fetch API to hit them, but they don't actually return like any new data. But they can be cool because you can still submit stuff to them and go through the whole process of learning how to interact with an API without having to actually use like a quote unquote real one or one that you may have to pay for or whatever. So maybe you can leverage that also in this small to-do list app. Now, once you've done that, I think you can be pretty confident that you know what you're doing, that you have a really good, more than basic, a strong foundation in JavaScript. And now you can redo that same app perhaps using Next.js, using React, using something else. If you wanted a slightly more challenging one, maybe a weather app. In fact, we do something like this. We do exactly this in Parsity. We have people make a weather app, and we have two versions of it. One is using Redux, and the other one is not. But this one uses an API, like a third-party API. We actually have our developers, the students in the program, go out and use a third-party weather API, learn how to use that API, learn how to take the user input handling and then fetch some data based on what the user says. Hey, what city are you? And you type in a city like San Francisco, for example. You click a button, you submit it to the API. The API then returns the data, and you show it on the screen. And you could even use something like the geolocation API, for example, which is a native window API. It just comes standard in your browser, where you can get the coordinates of the user and then send that to the API, and it would automatically know where you are. These are two kind of cool projects that you could use. I mean, another one is like New York Times API. I mean, the movie database API. I don't think these are great projects to like show off to people by any means, right? I think these are cool projects to teach you stuff, and then you would then go out and then decide what other APIs can you now use to fetch data displayed on the screen in an interesting way, and that's going to take you really, really far. It's also just a good litmus test about like, okay, do I know this enough? That way you can get out of your own head, because I think that's where a lot of us tend to get stuck. I have this happen to myself as well. I'm an engineering manager, and sometimes I think, wait, do I know JavaScript enough? I was working with a senior like architect on the team, some like front end expert, and he could code circles around me, and I thought, maybe I need to go back and learn more JavaScript. Maybe I need to learn Rust now. Maybe I need to learn a real programming language. And I talked to the principal engineer on my team, and he said, Brian, you got to stop. There is a limit to the technical ability that you can maintain, right? There's a limit to just learning more and more stuff. You can just keep adding more tools to your toolbox until you're drowning in knowledge, which I think too many people overemphasize. I think learning lots of JavaScript is great. I think it's cool. I think it's fun to learn. I also think that you cannot learn all of it. That should never be your goal, and that you have to get practical with it, because that is what, one, makes you employable, and two, teaches you the most. You could read an entire book on JavaScript, and you could probably repeat it and tell me all about JavaScript and the nuances and all this cool stuff. And then I could sit down with you and say, great, I'm really glad you read that book and you schooled me all about closures and prototypal inheritance and functional programming and all that. Now let's make a to-do list. And you'd look at me and say, I don't know how. And then we'd both cry. So don't fall into that trap. Make sure you're getting practical along the way. If you need help, or if you want another type of test, I have a cool test called the Framework Developer Test. This is a test I used to give out to people that I would mentor. I'd say, oh, so you're a JavaScript developer. How about you try this test? And it wasn't to be mean or make them feel bad. It was just to see, where are your JavaScript skills currently at? And it was a fairly simple exercise. It was like, build a form. When you click a button, the form submits the data to an API. The form is not clickable until all the fields are filled out. You can't use any libraries. You cannot use a framework. You have to use vanilla JavaScript, HTML, and CSS. 90% of people had a very difficult time with this problem, which was enlightening to me. Maybe you're hearing this and you say, that sounds really easy. I'm glad. If it sounds like it's not really easy, I'm also glad. That should illuminate an area for you to focus on and maybe do. So giving you about 3 options for projects to do and a lot of stuff. Hope that's helpful. And if you want any help, reach out. Have some free resources also at parsity.io that you can check out on the site. Happy to give those out to you and work with you, even if it's not with us. Always want to see people getting over that JavaScript hump and becoming better developers. See you around. That'll do it for today's episode of the Develop Yourself podcast. To learn more about becoming a software engineer with us, then check out parsity.io. If you're not quite ready for that, then jump into our dev30.xyz program, which is 30 days of working on your mindset, habits, and JavaScript skills. Totally worth it. See you next week.